David sat in the quiet solitude of his study, the dim light casting long shadows across the walls. The air was heavy with the scent of aged books and cedar, remnants of a life meticulously built over 2 decades of marriage. He held the note Lisa had left on the counter earlier that day. The words, written in her flowing cursive, seemed like a dagger to his heart. Even to himself, he realized that wasn't a bad. David, I need more than this life offers. Brian understands me in ways you never could. Please don't make this harder than it needs to be. He read it for the 10th time, still unable to fully process its message. Lisa, his wife of 20 years, the woman he had envisioned growing old with, had left him for Brian, a younger man who oozed charm but lacked substance. David knew Brian's type all too well. Smooth talking and morally bankrupt. The realization stung deeply, not only because of Lisa's betrayal, but also because of the years he had spent building a life for her, only to watch it crumble in the span of a few paragraphs. The house was eerily silent. Gone were Lisa's laughter and her off-key singing that used to fill the kitchen on Sunday mornings. David's once steady world had been thrown into chaos, and the silence amplified the storm raging inside him. But David was not a man to act on impulse. Pain fueled his resolve, sharpening his focus. He went to his desk and unlocked the drawer where he kept his personal files. Among them was a thick folder labeled Brian, private. David had known about Brian for months, though he'd kept the knowledge to himself, biding his time. Inside the folder were detailed reports from a private investigator, receipts, and photographs. Brian wasn't just a young charmer, he was a fraud, deeply in debt and involved in dubious business dealings. David ran a hand through his hair and let out a long breath. Part of him wanted to walk away from the mess Lisa had created, to start over and leave her to her illusions. But another part, the part that had sacrificed so much for her and their life together, wanted justice. It wasn't about revenge, he told himself. It was about accountability. Lisa had made her choices, and now she would face the consequences. He dialed the number on his phone. The call was answered after a single ring. "Karen," David said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "I need your help." Karen, his younger sister and a lawyer with a reputation for being both shrewd and compassionate, didn't need to ask why he was calling. "I'll be at your place in an hour," she said simply. As he waited, David poured himself a glass of whiskey and stared out the window into the inky night. The city lights twinkled in the distance, a stark contrast to the darkness enveloping his home. Memories of Lisa flooded his mind. Her smile, the way her eyes lit up when she laughed, the warmth of her hand in his. But those memories were tainted now, like a painting, smeared with ash. By the time Karen arrived, David had mapped out the first steps of his plan. They sat together at the dining table, the folder open between them. "She left me a note," David began, his voice calm but laced with pain. "She thinks she's moving on to some brand new life with Brian. But Brian is a house of cards, and I intend to show her exactly what she's chosen." Karen nodded, her sharp green eyes, so much like her brother's, narrowing as she flipped through the evidence. "If this is the road you want to take, David, you need to be sure there is no turning back once we start." David met her gaze, his resolve unwavering. "I've spent 20 years building her dreams, sacrificing my own. If she's going to destroy what we had, she won't get to walk away unscathed." Karen sighed, a mixture of sympathy and determination on her face. "Then, let's begin." In that moment, David's pain transformed into purpose. He wasn't just a man scorned. He was a man ready to reclaim his life, no matter the cost. As the clock struck midnight, brother and sister began plotting the moves that would unravel Lisa's illusions and expose Brian for who he truly was. 2 weeks after Lisa left, David stood at the edge of the city park overlooking the river. The water moved in steady currents, glistening under the morning sun. It was a quiet place where he often came to think. In his hand was the latest report from Karen. It detailed everything he needed to know about Brian, his growing debts, falsified credentials, and a failed business associates in financial ruin. David had suspected Brian was trouble, um, but seeing it laid out so plainly um, made the man's instability even clearer. And Karen had been meticulous. He's not just reckless, David, she'd said during their last meeting. He's dangerous. If Lisa thinks this is a step up, she's in for a rude awakening. David's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was Karen again. I've got something, she said, her voice tight with urgency. You remember that land deal Brian's been bragging about? The one he supposedly closed to secure his future? David replied, his tone dripping with skepticism. It's a sham. He leveraged a loan against property he doesn't fully own. If the lender digs into his finances, he's done. And the best part? It's all public record. David's lips curled into a grim smile. That's the opening I needed. Come, stay here. Sit safe. Over the next few days, David began laying the groundwork for the fallout. He wasn't one to act rashly, even when the betrayal still stung like an open wound. Every step had to be precise, every move deliberate. Lisa had chosen to chase a fantasy, and David would ensure she understood the reality of her decision. At a trendy downtown cafe, Lisa sat across from Brian, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently on the marble table. Her golden hair caught the sunlight, but there was a tension in her eyes that hadn't been there before. The novelty of her new life had started to wear thin. The spontaneous trips and late-night dinners were giving way to Brian's erratic behavior and growing paranoia. Are you listening, Brian? She asked, her voice sharp. I stared up at her expectance at this moment. He looked up from his phone, his expression tight. I said, I'm working on it, Lisa. These things take time. Lisa leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. You said the investors were ready weeks ago. Now you're saying the deal's delayed again? I left everything for you, Brian. Don't make me regret it. Brian flinched. But before he could respond, a server approached with their check. Lisa's sharp glance was enough to silence him for now. As they left the cafe, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that her life with Brian was starting to crack, much like the foundation of their lofty dreams. Meanwhile, David moved quietly but strategically. Using the information Karen had uncovered, he reached out to an old college friend, Tim, who worked as a financial analyst. Over lunch, David explained the situation, carefully omitting personal details. I'm feeling scared right now about everything, Joe. I don't know. I really don't want to talk to this woman about how I was being, and that was one of the last times. You telling me this guy is leveraging fake assets to secure loans? Tim said, shaking his head. That's not just unethical, it's criminal. David nodded. What if the lenders were made aware of the truth? Tim smirked. They'd pull their funding immediately. He'd be in default faster than you can blink. Good, David said, sliding a file across the table. Here's everything they need. It wasn't long before the ripples began. Brian's deal fell apart when the bank froze his accounts, citing irregularities. His investors pulled out, leaving him scrambling to cover his losses. The whispers started soon after. At parties, in business circles, and even within Lisa's social network. Brian's polished facade was crumbling, and people were beginning to see the man behind the mask. Lisa, oblivious to the full extent of David's involvement, watched as her new life descended into chaos. Brian's charm gave way to fits of anger and blame. Bills piled up, and his promises of luxury and stability evaporated like morning mist. The man she had risked everything for was revealed as a hollow imitation of the fantasy she'd pursued. Lee said, ha. Oblivious to the full extent of David's involvement, was revealed as a hollow imitation of the fantasy she'd pursued. Late one evening, Lisa sat alone in the dimly lit apartment she now shared with Brian. She stared at the faded wallpaper and cheap furniture, a far cry from the elegance of her former home. Her phone buzzed with a text from Susan, her closest friend. Lisa, I hate to say this, but you need to know Brian's reputation is ruined. Everyone's talking about how he scammed his way into his deals. Are you okay? And Lisa's chest tightened as she reread the message. Reality crashed down on her with suffocating clarity. She thought she'd escaped to something better, but all she'd done was trade security for illusion. Trig, seems like you work crews? You want to be more than that? As the weeks passed, David kept his distance, watching from afar as Lisa's dream unraveled. He wasn't bitter. Lisa had made her choice. Now, she had to live with it. Lisa stood at the window of the small apartment she shared with Brian, staring out at the city's flickering lights. Her fingers trembled as she clutched her phone, rereading Susan's text for the 100th time. The words were clear, but they refused to make sense. Brian's reputation was ruined. Everyone was talking about his schemes. How had it all unraveled so quickly? Yet, it's so good. It pro. But then Susan pushed the phone away from her and spoke, tears strepping, clear, and she recalled something else that had always come easy to her in the past. Because it had sense now. Brian's promise of a thrilling life had seemed like a beacon. He'd painted himself as an unstoppable force, a man who could open doors to a world of excitement and prosperity. Lisa had convinced herself that leaving David, stable, dependable David, was the right thing to do. But now, she was standing in a drafty apartment with peeling paint, wondering if she had destroyed her life for nothing. In the kitchen, Brian sat hunched over his laptop, his frustration palpable. He hadn't said much to Lisa in days, snapping at her questions and shutting down conversations. He was fighting a losing battle to keep up appearances as creditors and lawyers circled like vultures. Lisa, he called, his tone curt. Have you seen my folder with the financial documents? Lisa hesitated, trying to suppress the irritation rising within her. No, Brian, why would I have it? It's not my job to keep track of your things. Brian slammed the laptop shut, his face darkening. You think this is easy? You think it's fun? Dealing with this mess? She crossed her arms, her voice sharper than she intended. I think you made it sound like you had everything under control, Brian. And now, look at us. For a moment, the two stared at each other, the tension between them as suffocating as the stale air in the apartment. Then Brian looked away, muttering under his breath. Lisa turned back to the window, her anger giving way to exhaustion. See this? Across town, David sat in his own quiet home. The space still bore traces of Lisa Driscoll, a vase she'd picked out, the faint scent of her favorite vanilla candles lingering in the air. He'd spent weeks meticulously setting his plan into motion, knowing that Lisa's fantasy couldn't withstand the weight of reality. Now, as he reviewed the latest updates from Karen, he realized just how far things had fallen for Lisa and Brian. Karen's reports detailed Brian's mounting legal troubles. The bank had officially called in the fraudulent loans, leaving Brian with no safety net. Worse still, his former business partners were now cooperating with authorities, each eager to save themselves at Brian's expense. The charade was over, and Brian's reputation as a slick entrepreneur had turned into a cautionary tale of greed and recklessness. David set the reports aside and leaned back in his chair. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to reflect on his feelings. He told himself that this was about justice, about making sure Lisa and Brian faced the consequences of their actions. But as he stared at the empty space on the wall, where Lisa's favorite painting had hung, he wondered if there wasn't a part of him still hoping she would realize what she'd lost. For years, the murderer and the threat to his life had been fixated on what a price he'd pay. And now he regained his focus and wondered if there wasn't a part of him still hoping she would realize what she'd lost. But as he stared at the empty space on the wall where Lisa's favorite painting had hung, he wondered if there wasn't a part of him still hoping she would realize what she'd lost. This time he felt the same act as he did when the stranger face leaked over the bed. Yet Lisa's awakening began in small, cruel increments. The first blow came when Brian announced they had to sell her car, a sleek coupe he'd bought her as a gift to mark the start of their new life. "We need the cash," he said flatly, avoiding her gaze. Lisa protested, but Brian's tone left no room for negotiation. "Do you want to keep the car, or do you want to pay the rent next month?" The humiliation of it stung. Lisa had never imagined herself in such a position, stripped of the luxuries she once took for granted. Her resentment grew with every passing day, fed by Brian's constant excuses and dismissive attitude. The second blow came during a chance encounter with Susan at a cafe. Lisa had avoided her friends since leaving David, knowing how many of them disapproved of her choice. But she couldn't avoid Susan's sharp gaze as they stood awkwardly by the counter, waiting for their coffee orders. "Lisa?" Susan said after a tense silence. "How are things?" Lisa forced a smile, but it faltered. "Fine. Everything's fine." Susan didn't press, but the look in her eyes said she knew better. As Lisa walked away, she heard Susan mutter to another friend, "Oh, man, she didn't look fine to me." The final blow came when Lisa found Brian's phone left carelessly on the table. A message from a woman named Erica flashed on the screen. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Miss you already. Erica Bynes." Lisa's heart sank. She opened the message thread, her hands trembling. The exchanges were explicit, filled with promises and plans that mirrored the words Brian had once whispered to her. Rage and humiliation collided in her chest. She confronted Brian the moment he walked through the door. "Who is Erica?" she demanded, holding up his phone. Brian froze, his usual charm failing him. "Lisa, it's not what you think." "Pat, don't insult me," she snapped. "How many lies have you told me? Was anything you said ever true?" Brian didn't answer, and in his silence, Lisa found her answer. That night, Lisa sat alone on a threadbare couch, staring at the photos on her phone. Images of her and David, laughing, celebrating anniversaries, building a life together, flickered across the screen. She realized how blind she had been, chasing an illusion of freedom and excitement, while throwing away everything that truly mattered. Lisa wanted to call David to apologize, to beg for a second chance. But as the hours dragged on, she knew it was too late. David wasn't a man who looked back. And now, all she had left was the bitter taste of regret. David sat in the quiet of his office, the soft hum of his computer the only sound in the room. The once familiar ache of betrayal had dulled, replaced by a quiet resolve. Lisa's world was crumbling as expected, each misstep with Brian uncovering deeper cracks in her judgment. He had observed from afar, not out of gloating but out of necessity. Closure, he realized, could only come once the consequences of her choices had fully played out. Karen's latest update was concise but illuminating. Lisa had contacted a mutual friend, Susan, to discuss her situation. Susan, loyal to David, had relayed the details. Lisa was desperate, her illusions shattered by Brian's infidelity, debt, and complete lack of integrity. She had spoken wistfully of the stability she had with David, how she never appreciated what she had. Susan had ended the call with a warning for Lisa. "You might want to reach out to him, but don't expect him to be the same man you left." David felt no rush of satisfaction at Lisa's suffering. If anything, there was a pang of sadness. 20 years of marriage, countless memories, and shared dreams were now reduced to this: a crumbled foundation, two people living parallel lives with nothing left in common. Yet as much as he mourned the loss, he understood one immutable truth. He couldn't save her from herself. Across the city, Lisa sat in her now empty apartment, surrounded by the debris of her shattered dreams. Brian was gone, leaving behind nothing but unpaid bills and broken promises. The landlord had given her a week to vacate the apartment, citing months of missed rent. Her attempts to contact Brian had been met with silence. The man she had left David for, the man who had promised her excitement and a future, had vanished without a trace. Lisa scrolled through her phone, her finger hovering over David's contact. She couldn't count how many times she'd tried to call him in the past week, only to hang up before he could answer. What could she say? How could she explain the choices that had led her here? Every attempt at forming an apology sounded hollow, even in her own head. You're, she muttered, because she found herself missing him. I know. Too old to be remembered. Memories of their life together flooded her mind. David's steady presence at her side during her mother's illness, his unwavering support when she struggled to launch her small business, the quiet evenings spent watching movies on the couch. Those memories now felt like fragments of a life she had recklessly discarded for something that was never real. The following weekend, Lisa found herself standing outside David's home. The house looked the same. Its clean, white exterior and neatly trimmed lawn a testament to his meticulous nature. Her heart pounded as she rang the doorbell. She wasn't sure what she hoped to find on the other side. Forgiveness? A chance to explain? Or merely the closure she so desperately needed? When the door opened, it wasn't David who greeted her, but Karen. Dressed casually, Karen leaned against the doorframe, her expression unreadable. To this day, she does not know she was waiting for David to come to her for help. Lisa, she said after a long pause, what are you doing here? Lisa hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish. I need to talk to David. Is he home? Karen's gaze hardened. Why? She asked bluntly. What could you possibly have to say to him now? I'm sorry. Lisa swallowed hard, her voice trembling. I just want to explain. To apologize, please, Karen. Karen crossed her arms, her stance unwavering. David doesn't owe you anything, Lisa. He's moved on. You need to respect that. Moved on. A letter caught in hand and I, lies. Focusing entirely on me. Look, Karen said, her voice gentler now. I'll let him know you came by, but don't expect a miracle. David's been through enough. Because of you. Lisa nodded, tears welling in her eyes. She turned and walked back to her car, the weight of Karen's words pressing down on her. Inside the house, Karen found David in the kitchen preparing coffee. He glanced up at her questioningly. She was here. Well, Karen said, simply. David didn't ask who. He already knew. What'd you want? To talk? To apologize, maybe? I told her you've moved on. David leaned against the counter, his expression thoughtful. And do you think I have? Karen raised an eyebrow. Have you? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out the window at the backyard, the garden he and Lisa had once planted together. I think, he said finally, I've moved on enough to know that going back wouldn't change anything. Karen nodded, satisfied. Good. Later that night, Lisa sat in her car outside a hotel she had hastily booked for the week. The encounter with Karen had left her hollow, her hope dwindling. She realized she had no one to blame but herself. She had chosen to leave stability and love for a fleeting fantasy. And now that fantasy had turned to dust. As she stared at the empty parking lot, she thought of David, his calm strength, his steady devotion. She thought of the life they'd built together and the way she'd let it all slip away. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered to herself, I'm sorry. But the words fell into the silence, unheard by the man she once called her husband. Lisa knew she would carry the weight of her choices for the rest of her life. Some mistakes, she realized, leave scars that never fully heal. The early morning sunlight streamed into David's kitchen, illuminating the tidy space with a soft glow. He stood at the counter, sipping his coffee as the scent of freshly brewed beans mingled with the crisp air drifting in from the open window. For the first time in months, David felt a sense of peace, a calmness that came not from the absence of chaos, but from within himself. Betrayal. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of revelations, heartbreak, and deliberate action. He had orchestrated a plan to reveal the truth, not out of malice, but to bring clarity to a situation muddied by betrayal. And now, with the dust settling, David found himself on the other side, bruised but not broken. Karen joined him at the table, her usual sharp demeanor softened by a rare smile. "You look like you finally slept well," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. David nodded. "I did. For the first time in a long while, I didn't wake up thinking about her." Karen studied him for a moment before speaking. "I think it's because you've let go. You've done what you needed to do, and now you're free of it all." David considered her words. He had spent so much time focused on Lisa's betrayal, on the pain she had caused and the justice he felt compelled to seek. Now, though, he realized Heron was right. He had reached the end of that chapter. "Have you thought about what's next?" Karen asked, leaning back in her chair. David chuckled softly. "Not really. I suppose it's time to figure that out." Karen's phone buzzed on the table and she glanced at the screen. "Speaking of moving forward," she said, grinning, "Susan wants to set you up with someone. Says you need to start dating again." David raised an eyebrow. "Susan has been saying that since the divorce papers were signed." "And she's not wrong," Karen shot back. "But no rush. Take your time." David smirked, shaking his head. "I think I'll focus on rebuilding my life first. Then I'll worry about meeting someone new." Meanwhile, Lisa was navigating the fallout of her choices in a quiet but determined way. She had moved into a modest one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, a far cry from the life of comfort and security she once had. Every corner of the space seemed to remind her of what she had lost. Not just material wealth, but the love and stability David had provided. Her days were spent job hunting and reflecting on the decisions that had led her here. At first, she had wallowed in self-pity, blaming Brian, the circumstances, and even David for her situation. But over time, she began to take responsibility. One evening, as she sifted through old photos on her phone, she came across a picture of her and David from their 10th wedding anniversary. They were smiling, arms wrapped around each other, the love between them undeniable. The memory brought tears to her eyes, but it also sparked a realization. She had spent so much time chasing excitement and fantasy that she had overlooked the beauty of what she already had. Now she was determined to rebuild, not for David, but for herself. Lisa reached out to a career coach, enrolled in a few online courses, and started applying for jobs outside her comfort zone. Each small step felt like progress, a way to reclaim her identity. For David, life was taking on a new rhythm. His mornings were quieter now, free of the tension that had once pervaded his home. He spent more time with friends, rediscovering hobbies he had neglected during his marriage. One afternoon, while walking through the park, he came across an outdoor photography exhibit. The vibrant images of cityscapes and nature caught his eye, and he struck up a conversation with the photographer. Before he knew it, he had signed up for a weekend photography class, something he had always wanted to try but never found the time for. As he stood in the park, camera in hand, David felt a sense of liberation. He wasn't just moving forward. He was rediscovering who he was outside of his marriage, outside of the roles he had played for so long. Months passed, and the threads of their lives continued to unravel in different directions. David and Lisa occasionally crossed paths at mutual friends' gatherings or in the city, but their interactions were brief and polite. The raw emotions that had once defined their relationship were replaced by distant cordiality. Lisa never explicitly apologized to David, though her eyes often spoke volumes when their gazes met. David, for his part, found that he no longer needed her apology. He had made peace with the past and embraced the future. Nevin. One evening, as David sat in his living room flipping through a book, his phone buzzed with a message. It was from Karen. "Thought you'd like to know. Susan's setup idea turned into a wine night. We're inviting you. Come if you're ready." David smiled, setting the phone aside. For the first time, he felt ready, not just for wine night, but for whatever life had in store.